Well, now let's get to the book of Daniel itself now, and just a few statements concerning the historical part of this first chapter, briefly again. The first chapter of the book of Daniel deals with the personal history of Daniel. Now, we might put it this way. There are four main divisions to the book of Daniel. First is number 1, chapter 1, the personal history of Daniel. Then we have the visions of Nebuchadnezzar in chapters 2, 3, and 4. Then the third section to the book of Daniel comes to the personal history of Daniel again, dealing with Daniel in the days of Belshazzar, interpreting the handwriting on the wall, and Daniel in the lion's den. That takes up chapters 5 and 6. Then the fourth section of the book of Daniel is that of the visions of the prophet Daniel, taking in all of chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So the book of Daniel isn't so hard to comprehend if you look at it in that light. Just four little divisions. Chapter 1, the personal history of Daniel. Chapters 2, 3, and 4, the visions of Nebuchadnezzar. And back to the history of Daniel again, chapters 5 and 6. And then the visions of Daniel, chapters 7 to 12. Now, Daniel, as we have said before, was of the royal house of Judah and was a descendant of Hezekiah. In fact, all of these four Hebrew boys were descendants of Hezekiah, and their being made eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon is a fulfillment of the 39th chapter of the book of Isaiah. When Hezekiah showed the ambassadors of Babylon through his riches, Isaiah the prophet came to him and asked him, "What did you show these men?" And he told him, "I have showed them all the riches of Judah." And Isaiah made this prediction. And that was over 100 years before its fulfillment. And that's something you can't do, predict something 100 years ahead of time with such infinite detail as did this prophet. And he told Nebuchadnezzar that your sons, which you shall beget, shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon, and shall serve him. Thus we have in this first chapter of the book of Daniel the literal fulfillment of that 39th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Daniel and his three Hebrew friends, all relatives, descendants of the king of Judah, were made eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. They were chosen because they had understanding in certain sciences. In fact, in the first chapter you find the story of Daniel and the three Hebrew children being fed on the king's meat so that they could become fat and fair and good-looking and more wise than the ordinary fellow. And Daniel made up his mind that he wouldn't eat of the king's meat. God gave him favor with the prince of the eunuchs, a special favor. And so he made this proposition to the prince of the eunuchs, who told Daniel that he was afraid if Daniel didn't eat the meat that he himself would get into trouble. Daniel just told him this: "You try us 10 days, feed us on pulse, and we'll see to it that we'll get along a whole lot better than these fellows eating of the king's meat." And so the fellow said, "Well, I could afford to try them 10 days. I've got 3 years to fatten them up and give them the proper training." So he said, "I'll just take you at your proposition." So he tried them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, they were fatter, and they were fair, and more beautiful, and they had more wisdom than all the wise men of King Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, God gave them the gift of knowledge and the gift of wisdom and helped them, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't know anything about that. God always helps people out if they will trust in Him and do what He wants them to do. So the story goes how that they succeeded in escaping eating of the king's meat, and the very last part of the first chapter of Daniel shows that they were actually better off and had more wisdom and more understanding and were better looking than all of the king's men combined. Now that's about all we need to say about the first chapter again. Now just a few statements concerning the second chapter down to where we left off last time. The second chapter now goes into the visions of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He was meditating when he went to sleep that night, or when he went to bed. He began to think about all the past, the present, and the future. And he began to think of his vast kingdom that he had founded. And he began to wonder, that I wonder what's going to happen to my kingdom after I die. I just wonder how long my kingdom, this vast empire that I have built up, how long it will continue after my death. And he became a little worried about it. I don't know whether he was feeling a little sick that night or not, whether he was thinking he might not live so long, but anyway, that was the thought that he was meditating upon when he went to sleep that night. So God came to him in a night vision and showed him a great image. And after he got up, he forgot what he had dreamed about. And he was so troubled, he thought it had some significance, some special significance. And so he called all the wise men of his realm and demanded of them that they not only tell him the interpretation, but they tell him the dream. Tell me what I have dreamed about, and then tell me what it means. Now that was a demand that was unheard of even in King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And yet these wise men of Babylon, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers, and all those so-called men of science in that day, every branch of those sciences claimed to reveal divine secrets, claimed to have an insight into the future. And so Nebuchadnezzar thought he would certainly get his vision interpreted without any trouble. All these different branches of science claim to reveal secrets, claim to look into the future, claim to be able to interpret things to come. Why, I won't have any trouble getting my dream brought back to my attention and the interpretation of it. But when he made the proposition to the men, they said, that's not possible. There isn't any man that can reveal what you dreamed about. You tell us your dream and we will tell you the interpretation. And so Nebuchadnezzar was in a rage with every one of these wise men and gave commandment that a certain one of his servants should kill every one of these wise men. Now that would take in Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children too. Now they were not called to this particular meeting when Nebuchadnezzar demanded of them this dream and vision. I don't know why, but they were not there with that crowd. When Daniel heard that the commandment had gone forth to destroy all the wise men of the realm because they could not tell the king the dream and the interpretation, why, he went to the executioner and he told him, don't be so hasty. Why all this haste? If you will give us time, we will promise to reveal to the king his dream and the interpretation. Now that was an act of faith. Almost anybody can make a promise like that, but to produce, that's another question, isn't it? But he says, if you give us time, we will promise you the dream and the interpretation. And so Daniel got the 3 Hebrew children together. The 4 of them got together in a prayer meeting. They actually prayed. They didn't just say their prayers, they prayed. And God, in His mercy, revealed to Daniel, not to all 4 of them, but to Daniel, who had special understanding in visions and dreams, according to the first chapter and the last verses. God revealed to Daniel this same thing. In other words, He permitted Daniel to dream what he had brought to the attention of Nebuchadnezzar in his dream. So he went to the executioner and told him that, I'm ready to tell the king now his dream and the interpretation. So they hastily went in before the king, and he said, we have found a man of the captives of Judah who is able to tell the king his dream and the interpretation. And when Daniel was brought before the king, he said, are you able to tell me my dream and the interpretation? Yes. And now I want to tell you something first, Mr. King. I'm not any smarter than any other man. I cannot do this of myself. There isn't any man that could do it. But he said, there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets. And I have prayed to Him, and my 3 friends prayed with me. We have got a definite answer from the God of heaven, the only one that can reveal secrets. For He knows everything in heaven and on earth and underneath the earth. Now, I said, here's what you were thinking about, Mr. King, when you went to bed that night. You were wondering what would happen to your kingdom, what would happen here after your day. It says, the great God hath made known to the king the dream, and we're going to give you the interpretation also. And said, now here's what you dreamed about. You dreamed of a great image, whose image was excellent, stood before you, and the form thereof was terrible. Now this beginning of verse 431 of your chapter, if you want to read the second chapter of Daniel, said the image head was of gold, the breast and the arms were of silver, the belly and the thighs of brass, the legs of iron, the feet part of potter's clay and part of iron. And he said, Mr. King, you saw that night a stone cut out of the mountain without hands, which smote the image on the feet, and brake the iron and the clay, and the brass, and the silver, and the gold. You saw that stone break all those metals, and they became like the chaff before the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away. Then you saw further that that stone which smote the image on the feet became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. That's the end of the dream. You remember that, Mr. King? Why, I certainly do. Just as fresh as if I had dreamed it for the first time. That's exactly what I dreamed about. You're wonderful. Now then, what does it mean? And Mr. Daniel started in telling what the interpretation was. And this is why I can make these statements I made to you a few minutes ago. You don't need to worry about misunderstanding prophecy. You don't need to worry your little head about what it means at all. For all these visions of Daniel, God himself interpreted for the writer, and the writer told us what God told him that those different things mean. And for the life of me, I cannot comprehend how there could be any difference of opinion concerning a simple interpretation of God himself. If the prophet Daniel had enough intelligence to understand God and what God said these things mean, and if he had intelligence enough to record for us in human language and make it clear enough for us so that we can understand what God told him that these things mean, then where could there be any room for any argument or any difference of interpretation? Can you know where we could find any? You see any room for it? I don't, for the life of me. So I would advise you to just be simple, be consistent, be sensible, and believe what the interpretation itself says.